July 14th, 1944, Susupe Internment Camp, Saipan. The air inside the canvas medical tent was thick with the suffocating heat of the Micronesian summer, compounded by the sharp medicinal sting of DDT powder and the underlying copper scent of dried blood. Hanako sat rigid on the edge of the examination cot, her knuckles white as she clutched the collar of her torn uniform. Her scalp burned with an incessant, maddening itch, a physical manifestation of her shame. Hundreds of lice moved through her matted black hair, a living reminder of the weeks spent rotting in the limestone caves. "Please, miss, it has to be done," the interpreter said, his voice low, lacking the harsh bark she expected from the enemy. Captain Miller, a tall American with weary eyes and a rank insignia she barely recognized, stepped forward. He held no weapon, only a basin of steaming water and a bar of white ivory soap. The scent of the soap, clean, milky, alien, wafted towards her, clashing with the stench of misery surrounding them. Hanako recoiled, shielding her head with her forearms. "Don't touch me!" she screamed in Japanese, her voice cracking. In her mind, the touch of an American man was a prelude to defilement, a fate worse than the cliffs of Marpy Point. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, for the violence the propaganda had promised. Instead, she heard the sound of water being poured gently. The doctor placed the basin on the stool and took a step back, holding his palms up, a universal sign of peace, or perhaps a surrender to her dignity. "Tell her," Miller murmured to the interpreter, "I am just going to wash the sickness away, nothing else." For those fascinated by the quiet moments that bridge the divide of war, please subscribe and share your country's flag in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, the caves of Marpy Point. The dampness of the cave was not water. It was the condensation of breath, fear, and the slow decay of the living. Hanako crouched in the furthest recess of the limestone cavern, her knees pulled tight against her chest. The darkness was absolute, save for the occasional flicker of a dying candle deeper in the tunnel where the wounded groaned in a collective, delirious chorus. Outside, the world was ending. The rhythmic thumping of American artillery had ceased an hour ago, replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. It was the silence of the hunt. Hanako's hand drifted to her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal loops of a pair of rusty surgical scissors. They were dull, pitted from the humidity of the Mariana Islands, but they were the only weapon she had left. Not for the enemy, but for herself. The imperial decree had been clear: death before dishonor. Yet, as she looked at the young soldier beside her, a boy of no more than 16, his leg bound in filthy rags, her grip on the scissors loosened. "Water," the boy rasped, his eyes glazed. "There is no water, Tanaka-kun," Hanako whispered, wiping sweat from his fevered brow. Her own skin felt like it was crawling. The itch began at the nape of her neck and spread like wildfire across her scalp. She dug her fingernails into her skin, scratching until she felt the warm wetness of blood. The lice were relentless. They thrived in the filth, indifferent to rank or honor. In this darkness, she felt less like a nurse of the Imperial Army and more like an animal rotting in a burrow. A voice boomed from the cave entrance, amplified by a loudspeaker. The Japanese was accented, broken, but understandable. "Come out. We have food. We have water. Do not die for nothing." A murmur ran through the cave. A wounded officer near the front pulled the pin on a grenade, his face a mask of grim determination. But Hanako looked at Tanaka. He was too weak to move, too young to die for a jagged cliff edge. "We're going out," she decided, her voice trembling but firm. She stood up, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through her stiff limbs. The itch on her head flared again, a humiliating reminder of her degradation. She adjusted her tattered nurse's cap, trying to hide the matted mess of her hair. If she was to walk out to meet the American devils, she would do so with whatever shred of dignity remained. She hoisted Tanaka onto her shoulder, his weight crushing. Step by step, she moved towards the blinding white rectangle of the cave mouth. The light hit her like a physical blow. She squinted, bracing herself for the sound of machine gun fire. Instead, she saw tall figures in green fatigues, weapons lowered. One of them, a giant of a man with red hair, stepped forward and offered a canteen. Hanako flinched, expecting poison, expecting a blow. But the man simply uncorked it and poured a stream of clear, sparkling water onto the ground, then offered it again. She didn't drink. She stared at the water soaking into the dust, then at the American's face. He wasn't looking at her as a soldier or even as a woman. He was looking at the squirming, dark shadows visible in her hair under the harsh sunlight. He grimaced, not in hate, but in pity. Hanako's face burned hotter than the tropical sun. She gripped the rusty scissors in her pocket, shame piercing her heart more deeply than any bullet. The deuce-and-a-half truck roared to life, its engine vibrating through the metal bed where Hanako sat squeezed between two frightened elderly women. The vehicle lurched forward, kicking up clouds of red saipan dust that coated their throats and stung their eyes. Hanako kept her head lowered, her chin tucked into her chest, trying to make herself invisible. She gripped the fabric of her trousers, feeling the cold, hard outline of the rusty scissors hidden deep within her pocket. It was a secret weight, a singular point of control in a world that had spiraled into chaos. They were packed tight, a cargo of defeated souls. The air in the back of the canvas-covered truck was stagnant and heavy with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Across from her sat a young Marine guard, his rifle resting casually across his knees. He looked nothing like the demons described in the Imperial pamphlets. He was young, with sun-bleached hair, and a jaw that moved rhythmically as he chewed on something she couldn't identify. He looked bored, not bloodthirsty. This indifference was almost more terrifying than rage. It made their defeat feel trivial. The heat rose as the truck navigated the cratered roads. Sweat trickled down Hanako's back, exacerbating the torment on her scalp. The lice, agitated by the rising temperature, began to move frantically. It took every ounce of her discipline not to tear at her hair in front of the enemy. To scratch was to admit filth, to admit that the Imperial Army's hygiene discipline had collapsed along with its defenses. She closed her eyes, breathing through her mouth to avoid the stench, focusing entirely on the sharp pressure of the rusty scissors against her hip bone. Suddenly, the truck hit a deep rut, throwing the passengers forward. The young Marine reached out a hand to steady the elderly woman next to Hanako. The woman flinched and wailed, covering her face. The Marine pulled his hand back as if burned, looking confused. He reached for a canteen hooked to his belt, unscrewed the cap, and extended it toward Hanako. "Water?" he asked. The word was alien, but the gesture was universal. Hanako stared at the aluminum vessel. Her throat was parched, her tongue swollen like a piece of dry leather, but the warnings of the officers screamed in her memory. "They will poison you to save bullets." She looked at the Marine's blue eyes, searching for the treachery behind them. With a sharp, defiant motion, she turned her head away, refusing to acknowledge the offer. The Marine shrugged, took a swig himself, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Suit yourself, lady," he muttered. The truck began to slow. Through the rear opening, the landscape shifted from the wild, battered cliffs to a sprawling grid of fences and tents. Camp Susupe. It rose from the dust like a purgatory built of wire and canvas. Hanako's heart hammered against her ribs. The itching on her head became a roar, drowning out the engine. She wasn't just a prisoner of war. She was a prisoner of her own body, carrying a plague of vermin into the unknown. The processing line at Camp Susupe moved with the grinding efficiency of a factory conveyor belt. Hanako stood amidst the throng of women and children, the heat radiating off the packed earth in shimmering waves. Ahead, a cloud of fine white mist hung in the air, obscuring the checkpoint like fog in a mountain pass. It did not smell of the sea or the jungle. It smelled sharp, chemical, and profoundly artificial. Hanako clutched the lapels of her dirty tunic, her knuckles white. She watched as an elderly woman ahead of her was gestured forward by a masked American soldier. The soldier mimed a stripping motion. The old woman, weeping silently, loosened her obi and let her garments fall to the dust. The soldier pumped a metal canister, and a jet of white powder exploded from the nozzle, coating the woman's skin, hair, and weeping eyes. It was a delousing station. The Americans were not killing them with gas, as the rumors in the caves had predicted. They were cleaning them like livestock. When it was Hanako's turn, she stepped forward but did not lower her hands. The soldier, his face hidden behind a dust mask and goggles, pointed a gloved finger at her buttons. He said something in English. Short, flat, expectant. Hanako shook her head. To stand naked before the enemy was a violation that cut deeper than any wound. She felt the heavy weight of the rusty scissors in her pocket, a cold reminder of the choice she could still make. If he touched her, she would use them. The soldier paused. He seemed to read the lethal tension in her stance. He sighed, the sound muffled by his mask, and held up a hand, signaling, "Wait." He pointed to her trousers and tunic, then made a gesture indicating she could keep her undershift on. It was a small mercy, a crumb of dignity in a feast of humiliation. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Hanako unbuttoned her uniform. She folded the tunic carefully, placing it on the pile of confiscated clothing, though she managed to slip the scissors into the waistband of her thin cotton shift. She stood shivering in the tropical heat, exposed. The nozzle turned toward her. Whoosh. The world disappeared in a blizzard of white. The DDT powder hit her with surprising force, cold and dry. It filled her nose, her mouth, and coated her eyelashes. She squeezed her eyes shut as the soldier pumped the handle rhythmically down her back, under her arms, and finally a long, sustained blast directly onto her matted hair. The dust settled into the grime of her scalp, a suffocating blanket meant to smother the life crawling there. She coughed, tasting the metallic bitterness of the chemical on her tongue. When she opened her eyes, the world was hazy. She looked down at her hands. They were ghostly white. She looked at the other women. They were all statues of ash, stripped of color, rank, and history. The soldier waved her through. Hanako walked forward, the powder drifting from her with every step. She was no longer a nurse of the Imperial Army. She was a ghost, wandering through the gates of a strange new world, white as bone, yet beneath the chemical snow, the itch returned. Faint at first, then maddening. The powder had covered the shame, but it had not cured it. Night fell over Camp Susupe, bringing no relief from the heat, only a heavy, suffocating darkness. Inside the large communal tent, 50 women and children lay packed shoulder to shoulder on the rough canvas floor. The air was stagnant, a thick soup of recycled breath, the lingering chemical sharpness of the DDT powder, and the sour odor of fear. Hanako lay on her back, staring up at the invisible ceiling. Her body was exhausted, her muscles trembling from the trek and the trauma of the processing line, but sleep was an impossibility. The white powder that coated her hair like dry snow had failed to bring immediate peace. Instead, It seemed to have agitated the colony living upon her head. The lice, perhaps dying or merely frantic, moved with renewed vigor. Thousands of tiny legs scurried across her scalp, burrowing through the crust of dirt and chemical dust. It was a torture worse than hunger. In the silence of the tent, broken only by the whimpering of a child and the distant hum of a generator, Hanako felt the crushing weight of shame. She remembered the hot springs of Beppu, where the steam smelled of sulfur, and the water was so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. She remembered the ritual of scrubbing her skin until it was pink and raw before even entering the bath. That version of Hanako seemed like a stranger now, a phantom from a different life. The itch concentrated behind her ears and at the base of her neck, a burning, prickling sensation that demanded a violent response. She tried to clench her fists, to dig her nails into her palms, but the urge was overwhelming. Slowly, quietly, she reached into the waistband of her shift and withdrew the rusty scissors. The metal was warm from her body heat. She opened the blades. They were too dull to cut effectively, but the point was sharp enough for her purpose. She brought the metal to her scalp. She didn't cut, she scraped. The sensation was a mixture of exquisite relief and sharp pain. She gritted her teeth, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes as she raked the metal point across her skin. She scratched until the itch was replaced by the throbbing of raw flesh. She felt a warm trickle run down behind her ear, blood mixing with the sweat and the white powder. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She was trying to scrape away the filth, trying to carve out the contamination that made her feel less than human. Around her, the other women shifted. Even in the dark, she could feel their recoil. She was the leper among the outcast, the unclean among the defeated. When the morning light filtered through the canvas flaps, gray and merciless, Hanako sat up. Her head throbbed with a dull, feverish pulse. She touched her hair, and her fingers came away sticky. The blood had dried overnight, matting the hair into stiff, dark clumps that glued the white DDT powder into a grotesque helmet of scabs. A shadow fell over her. It was a Japanese monitor, a woman appointed by the Americans to keep order. She looked at Hanako's head, her eyes widening in disgust. "You," the monitor said, pointing toward the flap. "Medical tent, now, before you infect us all." Hanako stood up, her legs weak. She tucked the rusty scissors back into her pocket. She walked out into the blinding Saipan sun, her head held high, though she felt she was walking to her execution. The medical tent was a cathedral of canvas, filled with a light so bright it seemed to scour the interior of Hanako's skull. Unlike the caves, which smelled of earth and death, this place smelled of aggressive chemical purity, rubbing alcohol, iodine, and boiling water. To Hanako, it was not the scent of healing, but the scent of a laboratory where specimens were dissected. She sat on the edge of a high metal cot, her feet dangling above the wooden floorboards. Her hands were clamped tight over her lap, guarding the hidden pocket where the rusty scissors lay. Every nerve in her body was pulled taut, vibrating with the expectation of violence. Around her, American corpsmen moved with hurried efficiency, their voices a low rumble of unintelligible commands. A shadow fell across her. It was the tall doctor she had seen earlier, the one with the tired eyes, Captain Miller. Up close, he looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and his green fatigues were stained with sweat. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had been awake for 100 years. He said something to the Lice interpreter standing beside him, then turned his gaze to Hanako's head. His expression tightened. He reached out a hand, his fingers clad in rubber gloves, moving toward the matted, bloody ruin of her scalp. The movement triggered a primal panic in Hanako. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind. The blue-eyed devils, the despoilers of women. "Don't touch me!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate. She violently recoiled, shielding her head with her forearms, her body curling into a tight ball of defense. She waited for the blow. She waited for the interpreter to hold her down while the doctor forced his will upon her. Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers brushing the cold metal loop of the scissors. If they tried to hold her, she would strike. But the blow never came. The tent went quiet around them. Slowly, Hanako uncurled just enough to peer through the gap in her arms. Captain Miller had stepped back. He was not reaching for a weapon, nor was he reaching for restraints. He had turned to a metal tray on a nearby trolley. When he turned back, he held a rectangular object in his hand. It was a bar of soap. But not the gray, gritty soap she was used to in the scarcity of the war years. This was white ivory soap, pristine and smooth, looking like a block of solidified milk. He held it up, not threateningly, but as if presenting an offering. The scent hit her then, a clean, mild fragrance that cut through the sharp stench of iodine and the copper smell of her own blood. It was a smell from another world, a world of abundance and peace that she had almost forgotten existed. "Tell her," Miller murmured to the interpreter, his voice low and devoid of anger. He placed a basin of steaming water on the stool between them. "I am just going to wash the sickness away. Nothing else." Hanako stared at the white bar in his hand. It seemed impossibly clean against the backdrop of war. The tension in the room hung suspended on that single object. The rusty scissors felt heavy and useless in her pocket. Against a gun, she could fight. But against this quiet, white offering, she had no defense. The interpreter opened his mouth to bark a command, likely in order to sit still or be restrained, but Miller raised a hand to silence him. The tent fell into a heavy, expectant hush. The doctor understood that words were useless here. To this woman, English was the language of artillery fire and surrender demands. It carried no comfort. Instead, Miller turned his attention entirely to the basin of water on the metal stool. He moved with a deliberate slowness, broadcasting his intent like a pantomime actor. Hanako watched him through narrowed, distrustful eyes, her body still coiled tight, the handle of the rusty scissors damp against her palm. She watched for the trick, the sudden lunge. Miller picked up the bar of white ivory soap. He dipped it into the steaming water, then began to roll it between his large palms. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands. The friction created a rich, thick lather, far more luxurious than the thin, gray suds Hanako was accustomed to from the rationed soap of the Empire. The bubbles multiplied, covering his hands in white, airy clouds. The scent bloomed in the small space between them, a smell of milk, clean linen, and safety. It drifted across the invisible barrier of war, assaulting Hanako's senses not with violence, but with a terrifyingly potent nostalgia. It smelled like the bathhouse in Beppu before the sirens started. It smelled like a Sunday morning without air raids. Miller rinsed his hands, the water turning slightly cloudy, then lathered them again. He held his hands up, palms open, coated in the white foam. He showed her the front, then the back. No weapons, no hidden needles, only cleanliness. "Clean," he said softly, the word vibrating in his chest. He pointed to his hands, then pointed to her matted, blood-crusted hair. Hanako stared at the foam dripping from his fingertips. It was hypnotic. The contrast between his pristine, white-coated hands and her own filthy reality was stark. The propaganda had told her these men were beasts, monsters who defiled everything they touched, but beasts did not wash their hands before touching their prey. Beasts did not offer the luxury of sanitation to the defeated. A crack appeared in the fortress of her resolve. The itch on her scalp was screaming, a ceaseless agony of parasites eating her alive. She looked at the cool, soothing promise of the white lather. The desire for relief began to outweigh the desire for a martyrdom that no one would ever witness. Slowly, agonizingly, Hanako's arms lowered. Her muscles, locked in rigor for weeks, began to slacken. She did not nod, nor did she speak. She simply uncurled her fingers from the defensive, claws they had formed around her head. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest, inhaling the soapy fragrance deep into her lungs. Miller waited a beat longer, ensuring the permission was real. Then he stepped forward. He did not grab her. He simply dipped a cloth into the water and waited. Hanako closed her eyes, her hand slipping from the pocket, leaving the rusty scissors behind. She surrendered not to the enemy, but to the soap. The first contact was tentative, lighter than a breath. Miller placed a wet sponge against the crown of her head, allowing the warm water to trickle down through the hardened layers of blood and dust. Hanako flinched violently, her shoulders jerking up toward her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to bite, to scratch, to fight, but the warmth of the water was a sedative she hadn't expected. Miller didn't pull away. He murmured something low, a meaningless, rhythmic sound designed to soothe a frightened animal, and continued to soak her hair. The warmth began to penetrate the crust on her scalp, softening the scabs that had tormented her for weeks. Then came the soap. He worked the bar of white ivory soap into a thick lather in his hands before applying it to her head. His fingers were large and calloused, yet his touch was surgically precise. He didn't scrub with the roughness of a conqueror cleaning a spoil of war. He massaged with the patience of a craftsman restoring a damaged artifact. Hanako squeezed her eyes shut, her hands gripping the edge of the metal cot until her knuckles turned white. She braced herself for pain, but what she felt was an exquisite, confusing relief. The thick, cool foam encased the burning sores. As Miller's fingers worked the lather into the roots, the maddening itch that had driven her to self-mutilation began to subside, replaced by a dull, throbbing cleanliness. She heard the sound of water splashing into the metal basin below. She didn't dare look down. She knew what was leaving her body. The black filth of the caves, the copper tang of old blood, and the thousands of tiny crawling lives that had claimed her as their host. It was a physical exorcism. "Easy," Miller whispered. He used a fine-toothed metal comb now. This part hurt. The comb snagged on tangles and mats, pulling at her raw skin. But even the pain was different. It was a constructive pain, the pain of setting a bone, not breaking one. Hanako's breathing shifted. The ragged, shallow gasps of panic smoothed out into a long, trembling rhythm. The scent of the soap enveloped her, creating a private sanctuary within the busy tent. For a moment, she wasn't a prisoner in Saipan. She wasn't a defeated subject of the Emperor. She was just a woman having her hair washed. The humanity of the act was overwhelming. It dismantled her hatred more effectively than any interrogation could have. Finally, Miller poured a pitcher of clean water over her head for the final rinse. The cascade washed away the last of the suds. He squeezed the excess water from her hair, his movements efficient and respectful. Then he took a thick, fluffy white towel, another luxury she hadn't seen in years, and wrapped it around her head, twisting it into a turban. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his apron. "All done," he said. Hanako sat frozen. The weight on her head was gone, replaced by the soft, dry embrace of the towel. The itch was gone. The filth was gone. A single tear escaped from her squeezed-shut eyes, tracking a hot line through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, nor of joy. It was the sheer, crushing weight of gratitude she didn't want to feel for an enemy. Hanako sat on a wooden crate just outside the medical tent, the white towel still turbaned around her head like a crown of surrender. The air was cooler now, the fierce afternoon sun beginning to dip toward the Philippine Sea. From this vantage point, the camp looked less like a prison and more like a bustling, bizarre city. She watched American soldiers playing catch with a baseball, their laughter carrying over the fences. There were no executions, no torture pits, only the mundane rhythm of an army at rest. A young American nurse, her uniform crisp and unstained, approached with a metal tray. She placed it on the crate beside Hanako with a brief, shy smile, then retreated. On the tray sat 2 slices of bread, impossibly thick and white, like cake, and a slab of pink, glistening meat. Beside it was a mug of powdered milk. The smell of the meat, salty and fatty, assaulted Hanako's senses. It was the smell of Spam, the ubiquitous fuel of the American war machine. To a stomach that had known only roots, lizards, and rationed rice for months, the aroma was dizzying. Hanako looked at her hands. They were pale, scrubbed pink, and smelled of ivory soap. For the first time in weeks, she did not see dirt under her fingernails. She looked at the bread, then back at her hands. The connection was immediate and visceral. To eat with dirty hands was the act of a beast. To eat with clean hands was the privilege of a human. She reached out. The bread was soft, yielding under her touch. She took a bite. The flavor was bland, yet overwhelmed her palate with its texture. Soft, processed, abundant. Then the meat, rich with salt and grease. It was not the food of her ancestors, but it was the food of life. Tears pricked her eyes again, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming realization of the material power of her enemy. They had enough soap to wash prisoners and enough meat to feed them. How could Japan have ever hoped to defeat a nation that could mass-produce comfort? Captain Miller stepped out of the tent, wiping his glasses. He stopped when he saw her eating. He didn't smile triumphantly. He just nodded, a professional acknowledging a patient's progress. Hanako stopped chewing. She swallowed the heavy lump of bread. Slowly she reached into the hidden pocket of her trousers. Her fingers brushed the cold, pitted metal of the rusty scissors. For days, this object had been her only security, her ticket out of a life of shame. But the shame was gone, washed away down a drain in the medical tent. She pulled the scissors out. In the fading light, they looked pathetic, jagged, brown with corrosion, a tool of infection rather than liberation. Miller watched her, his body tense slightly. Hanako held the scissors out, handle first. She didn't bow, and she didn't speak. She simply offered the weapon to the man who had offered her soap. Miller hesitated, then reached out and took the scissors. He weighed them in his hand for a moment, understanding the gravity of the exchange, before slipping them into his apron pocket. "Good," he said softly. "You won't need those." The canvas flap of the communal tent parted, and Hanako stepped inside. The transition from the fresh, open air to the stagnant humidity of the shelter felt like walking into a wall. The tent was dim, lit only by a single kerosene lantern hanging from the center pole, casting long, dancing shadows against the fabric walls. The chatter died instantly. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Hanako stood near the entrance, acutely aware of the white towel wrapped turban-style around her head. It glowed in the gloom, a beacon of difference. But more than the sight of her, it was the smell. The crisp, milky scent of ivory soap drifted from her, cutting through the heavy odor of sweat, unwashed bodies, and fear that defined their existence. It was an olfactory invasion. A woman near the back, the wife of an officer who had died at Marpy Point, stood up. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hard with the fanaticism of the bereaved. She marched toward Hanako, stopping just inches away. She sniffed the air, her nose wrinkling in disgust and suspicion. "You smell like them," the woman hissed, "like the enemy." A murmur of agreement rippled through the tent. The accusation hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. What did you trade for that cleanliness? What part of your soul did you sell to the American devils? Hanako felt the old shame threaten to return, but she grounded herself. She remembered the gentle pressure of Miller's hands, the warm water, the simple, transactionalist dignity of the act. She was not the one who should be ashamed. "I am clean," Hanako said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. "That is all." "They don't waste soap on prisoners," the officer's wife spat. "Not unless they want something." "He wanted to kill the lice," Hanako replied. She reached up and touched the soft terry cloth of the towel. "The doctor, he washed my hair. He used a bar of white soap. He did not touch me otherwise. He did not ask for names. He did not ask for secrets." She looked around the circle of faces. She saw envy warring with pride. She saw women scratching their scalps unconsciously, the lice a constant tormenting companion that they had come to accept as a badge of loyalty. "It was just soap," Hanako whispered, the truth of it ringing louder than any propaganda broadcast. "Warm water and soap. He treated me like a patient, not a prisoner." She walked past the accuser and sat down in her designated spot on the mat. She began to unwrap the towel. As the damp, clean hair fell around her shoulders, the scent of the soap bloomed outward, filling the cramped space. It was a scent that recalled mothers, childhood baths, and a time before the world had turned into fire and ash. The silence in the tent shifted. It lost its edge of hostility and took on a quality of yearning. Minutes passed. The officer's wife retreated to the shadows, muttering. But then a slight movement came from the left. A young girl, no older than 18, crawled across the mats on her hands and knees. Her hair was a tangled nest, her face etched with the misery of the itch. She stopped in front of Hanako. She didn't look at Hanako's face. She looked at the clean, dark strands of her hair. "Does it—" The girl's voice trembled, barely audible. "Does it still hurt?" Hanako shook her head. "No. The itching is gone." The girl looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me how to ask him." 2 weeks later, the medical tent at Camp Susupe had transformed from a place of terror into a sanctuary of order. The screams of the dying were less frequent now, replaced by the murmur of recovery and the clatter of sterilized instruments. Sunlight streamed through the rolled-up canvas sides, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, no longer the choking dust of the caves, but the lazy dust of a Sunday afternoon. Hanako stood by the triage table, wearing a clean white apron over her issued clothing. Her hair, now shiny and free of parasites, was pulled back neatly. She moved with the confident efficiency of a veteran nurse, translating instructions for a terrified mother who had just been brought in from the jungle. "It is medicine," Hanako said in Japanese, her voice firm but kind. She held up a small paper cup. "Drink it. It will stop the fever." The mother hesitated, looking at the tall American orderly standing nearby. Hanako gently touched the woman's arm. "Look at me," she said. "Look at my hair. They healed me. They will heal you." The woman drank. Across the tent, the flap opened, and Captain Miller entered. He looked as tired as ever. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the endless casualties of the Saipan campaign, but his eyes were clear. He paused when he saw Hanako administering aid. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched for a moment, observing the ripple effect of his earlier intervention. Hanako sensed his presence. She finished settling the patient and turned to face him. The bustling noise of the clinic seemed to fade into the background. There was no salute. Hanako did not bow in the way a subject bows to a conqueror, with forehead to the floor in abject submission. Instead, she stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her apron, and performed a seikei, a deep, respectful bow from the waist, acknowledging a teacher, a savior, an equal in the realm of healing. Miller stopped amidst the chaos. He straightened his posture, removing his cap. He didn't bow. It wasn't his custom, but he dipped his head in a solemn nod, a gesture devoid of military arrogance. It was a silent treaty signed in the air between them. He moved onto his rounds, and Hanako returned to her station. On the table sat a fresh box of supplies that had just arrived from the beachhead. She opened it. Inside were rows of white ivory soap, wrapped in paper, smelling of civilization. A new group of prisoners was being led in, filthy, scratching, their eyes wide with the same animal panic Hanako had felt weeks ago. A young girl at the front of the line cringed as an orderly approached. Hanako stepped forward. She picked up a bar of soap, feeling its smooth, heavy rectangular weight in her palm. It was just a blend of fat and alkali, a simple object. Yet in this camp, on this blood-soaked island, it was the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. It did not destroy, it restored. She walked toward the frightened girl, holding the soap out like a lantern in the dark. "Come," Hanako said softly. "Let me show you. It is going to be all right."